our steel plants, which are really, really important. I've been saying they're the crown jewels of our manufacturing sector. And we can't think that Canada can have a strong national security if we don't have steel made in Canada. So of course, we need to help them pivot, retool.
For decades, Canadian steel has been a vital piece of the U.S. auto supply chain. American carmakers have relied on Canadian mills for the grades needed to build millions of vehicles. Trump's sectoral tariffs, framed as a push to revive U.S. production, are instead pushing automakers toward thinner margins, layoffs, and rising costs. Canada is pursuing a careful strategy. On one side, it remains at the negotiating table, seeking relief through trade talks. On the other, it is preparing a bold shift, redirecting steel production to strengthen the domestic economy and reduce reliance on the U.S. market. That shift raises a larger question now hanging over Detroit. What happens if U.S. automakers suddenly find themselves short of Canadian steel?
When you're thinking of retooling, obviously we know that the type of steel, for example, in the steel sector that was developed in Canada is mainly steel that is for the U.S. automakers.
Canadian leaders have made it clear that steel is more than an export product. It is described as one of the crown jewels of the manufacturing sector, central to both jobs and national security. For decades, Canadian mills supplied U.S. automakers, producing exactly the grades needed for car frames, panels, and components. That dependency is now seen as a vulnerability. The new strategy is to pivot production. Plants are being encouraged to shift towards steel for housing construction, rail and port infrastructure, and even defense applications. The vision is wide-ranging: aerospace, shipbuilding, and the shipyards that maintain the armed forces. This is not only about securing a domestic industrial base. It is about ensuring that thousands of men and women in the steel sector keep working in jobs that are less exposed to political shocks south of the border. By broadening steel output into critical areas of home building and defense, Ottawa is rewriting the industrial playbook. Instead of being locked into a cycle of dependence on U.S. auto demand, Canada is building resilience into its economy.
We don't need cars from Canada. We don't need energy from Canada. We don't need anything from Canada.
What if Canada stopped supplying steel to U.S. automakers? This is not today's reality, but it is a scenario worth considering. According to the International Organization of Motor Vehicle Manufacturers, U.S. plants built 10.56 million vehicles in 2024. Each car contains about 800 to 900 kilograms of steel, with around 40% used for the body shell. That alone requires close to 3.8 million tons of flat steel each year. Data from the International Trade Administration shows Canada sends about 3.2 million tons of flat-rolled steel to the U.S., with roughly 40% tied to autos. That equals about 1.28 million tons, nearly one-third of the steel used in U.S. car bodies. If that supply vanished, the equivalent of 3.5 million vehicles would lack body steel. Even if U.S. and Mexican producers covered half the gap, production of 1.7 to 2 million vehicles could still face delays. On cost, when supply tightens, auto-grade steel has been shown to rise $150 to $300 a ton. For the 0.36 tons needed per car body, that adds $80 to $200 per vehicle, and spread across industry output, the total impact could reach $1 to $2 billion within months. These are estimated figures, not predictions. They show how much leverage Canada holds and how exposed U.S. automakers could be if tariffs push the relationship to the breaking point. These estimates show how fragile the U.S. auto supply chain could become if Canadian steel is pulled away. And that brings us back to the larger lesson. Trump's tariffs, promoted as part of making America great again, have instead exposed America's own vulnerability. What was meant to strengthen U.S. industry has given Canada a reason to build a stronger, more self-reliant future, and left America's auto sector staring at its own Achilles heel.
We begin with Prime Minister Mark Carney's European tour. Canada's push to diversify trade and economic partnerships amid a trade war with the U.S.
Canada is no longer reacting cautiously. Recently, Prime Minister Mark Carney has carried his message to Europe, presenting a clear plan to reduce reliance on a single market and to expand Canada's global reach. The focus is on energy, infrastructure, and critical minerals, sectors that give Canada real weight in international trade. These steps mark a deliberate acceleration of diversification. Rather than standing still, Canada is actively laying the foundation for new partnerships that stretch across the Atlantic and with upcoming projects on the Pacific coast into Asia as well. What matters most is that diversification is not framed as a defensive move. It is a proactive decision to anchor Canada in multiple trade networks at once.
Canada already is an energy superpower, but one long connected to one market, the United States, now trying to connect to many more.
The most powerful tools in this diversification are pipelines, ports, and LNG projects. The Trans Mountain expansion, completed at a cost of 34 billion Canadian dollars, is already changing flows. At the start of operations, shipments were split evenly between the US and Asia. Now, in August 2025, roughly 60% of heavy oil is sailing across the Pacific and only 40% south to American refineries. This shows the speed at which Canada has rebalanced. At the same time, Ottawa is moving ahead with new corridors.
With respect to Churchill, what's interesting about Churchill, but there is much more to it than Contrecoeur in terms of what it potentially unlocks. So it unlocks, as you just said, LNG, it potentially unlocks pathways for critical minerals and links into Europe.
The Port of Churchill in Manitoba has been identified by Carney as one of the first projects in a national infrastructure drive. It is planned as a hub for liquefied natural gas, critical minerals, and direct trade links with Europe. The choice of Churchill is symbolic. By investing in a northern gateway, Canada signals that even remote regions can be integrated into a global supply chain, strengthening national unity while also unlocking export potential that had been overlooked for decades. Together with LNG Canada at Kitimat and talks on refining capacity in Japan, these initiatives are carving out new routes that bypass U.S. bottlenecks.
This is no longer about survival. Canada is beginning to compete directly with the United States in global energy markets. In Europe, where Trump settled for a 15% tariff cap after threatening higher levels, industries are still searching for stable and affordable suppliers. Canada steps in with new capacity, offering oil, gas, and minerals with lower shipping costs and fewer policy risks. In Asia, the Trans Mountain Line and Kitimat Terminal give Japanese and Korean buyers an alternative to U.S. exports. Even the technical details matter. At the Westridge Marine Terminal, Aframax tankers can only be loaded to 70 or 80% because of depth limits. With dredging, those ships could sail at full capacity, cutting costs per barrel and sharpening Canada's price edge. Each of these improvements tilts the balance further, making Canada not a junior partner, but a competitor that can win contracts Washington assumed were safe.
Trump's strategy was built on the idea that tariffs would make Canada yield. The reality is the opposite. Ottawa has kept the core protections of USMCA while building a global network that makes it stronger. Pipelines and ports are expanding Canada's reach. Europe and Asia are welcoming a partner that delivers energy without sudden policy shocks. The United States now faces the risk of losing a dependable supplier at home and confronting that same supplier abroad as a rival. What began as an attempt to weaken Canada has backfired. Canada is emerging as a more competitive, more independent player, able to challenge U.S. dominance in the very markets where Trump thought he held control.
Denmark is accusing the United States, one of its closest allies, of acting more like an adversary by conducting covert operations in Greenland.
Denmark and the U.S. are close allies, not only in NATO, but in many different fields. Friends and allies, they don't spy on each other.
Greenland has long been viewed as a strategically important territory for global powers. With vast natural resources and a commanding position in the Arctic, it has drawn attention far beyond its size. Today, the island is again at the center of tension. Denmark has accused the United States of running covert operations to stir division inside Greenland, a charge that has shaken one of NATO's closest alliances. Danish officials warn that such influence campaigns violate international law and trust among allies. At the same time, Canada is moving in a very different direction. Instead of pressure, Ottawa is strengthening ties with Denmark through green energy and trade cooperation, signaling that the Arctic is no longer an arena dominated by Washington alone.
One way or the other, we're going to get it.
Trump's focus on Greenland is not new. The island offers enormous strategic value. From military bases that monitor Russia to deposits of critical minerals, securing Greenland would give the United States leverage in the global balance of power. Reports from Denmark's public broadcaster revealed that at least 3 Americans with connections to Trump or his administration were linked to covert influence campaigns. These operatives were said to encourage separatist sentiment and build networks sympathetic to Trump's ambitions. To many observers in Europe, this resembled Russia's earlier tactics in Ukraine, where local divisions were amplified before force was applied. Denmark responded by summoning the top U.S. diplomat in Copenhagen and opening investigations. The implications go beyond Greenland itself, raising doubts about whether the United States is undermining trust inside NATO, an alliance meant to prevent this very behavior.
Denmark and the U.S. are, like Canada, members of NATO.
The Danish public broadcaster uncovered evidence in a stunning investigation that men with ties to Trump tried to infiltrate Greenland, pointing to intelligence that at least 3 Americans with connections to the president were involved in covert influence operations. Trump has repeatedly threatened to annex the territory, which, like Canada, has vast critical minerals and strategic military bases in the Arctic.
While Washington's actions spark controversy, Canada is carving out a quieter but highly significant role with Denmark. Ottawa has been working with Copenhagen to build what some call a green trade corridor. In February 2025, Canada joined the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, a move that tied its Atlantic provinces to Denmark's world-leading expertise in offshore wind. Projects like the Toklu Wind and Hydrogen development in Newfoundland and Labrador, backed by Copenhagen infrastructure partners, aim to produce green hydrogen for export to Europe. Denmark's concept of energy islands, artificial platforms that connect wind farms and hydrogen production, is already influencing Canadian planning. Beyond energy, Canada's aluminum sector is also gaining an edge. Because Canadian aluminum is produced largely with hydropower, it is among the cleanest in the world. With the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism set to take effect in 2026, aluminum produced with fossil fuels will face new tariffs. That gives Canadian producers a competitive advantage, as Europe looks for reliable, low-carbon suppliers. In 2024, Canada-Denmark bilateral trade reached about $2.7 billion according to official figures, but the real significance lies in the kind of trade being developed. Green energy technology, hydrogen, and Arctic cooperation are all areas where Canada and Denmark are laying the groundwork for long-term influence.
What emerges are 2 competing futures. On one side, Donald Trump pursues influence with threats and alleged covert operations. On the other, Canada and Denmark build their position through cooperation, sustainable industries, and a steady link to Europe. Canada is not merely reacting to American pressure, By aligning with Denmark, it is creating strategic options that reduce dependence on the US market and broaden its reach across the Atlantic. The future of the Arctic will not be defined by who makes the loudest claims, but by who builds the most resilient alliances. On that front, Canada and Denmark already stand strong, showing that influence can be earned through partnership rather than force.